Okay, we are live, everyone. And today we're talking about something really, really serious and close to my heart. A bill going through in Australia at the moment that potentially will compromise encryption. We're going to get to the bottom of that, whether that's accurate. And so we're going to be talking today about why encryption is incredibly important and exactly what this Australian bill is going to cover, because it's not just going to affect Australia. Apparently, it's going to affect anyone who's part of the Five Eyes. So you've got America, Britain, New Zealand, Australia, Canada. They all share information. So it's a pretty important subject, and I'm absolutely delighted to have these two wonderful gentlemen joining me. So I have Perry Metzger, that I welcome back to the show. You've seen him before. I've interviewed him. He's a cryptography expert. He, of course, ran the mailing list that the Bitcoin white paper was first released on. Perry, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me on, Naomi.
And I wanted to introduce to the show Patrick Gray. So he runs a really popular podcast. He's an information security specialist. His podcast is Risky Business. And you've been covering this topic extensively to the point where one of your episodes was actually read out on Parliament floor. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was a Senate estimates hearing, but that was a bit of a surreal experience.
I bet it was. Well, welcome to the show. It's wonderful to have you.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So let's start at the very top. And Patrick, if you could just give us an overview of what this bill entails and why there are a lot of people who are pretty scared about it.
Look, I think first off, the reason I think that people are very scared of this, and it's justifiable, is 2013, the Edward Snowden disclosures rattled a lot of people and got people really thinking about these topics of surveillance. So anytime a government wants to, grant itself new magical powers in legislation, people justifiably get quite nervous. But look, the bill serves to do a few things. The first thing that they're seeking to do is essentially provide a framework and a process for technology companies to be able to voluntarily assist law enforcement in certain criminal investigations. And then there's the contentious part of the bill, which would force them to perform certain actions to help them access content when they have a warrant or when they have a legal authorization to access that content. So that might be, compelling them to provide some form of assistance to do a thing to help them get messages, right? That's an example. And the third and probably most contentious part of this is this idea of technical capability notices, where they might instruct a technology firm to build a capability or make a modification to a system that would allow them to obtain evidence, again, that they have a warrant or some form of, authority to obtain. So naturally, people have worried that means they're banning encryption. Well, I sort of prefer to think of this more as a device access bill rather than an encryption busting bill. Because I think, the way the government sees it is, look, you've got two people communicating from one device to another. They're end-to-end encrypted. We cannot intercept those messages, but we can perhaps obtain access to that device and get the messages that way. So that seems to be much more about, that seems to be much more what this bill is about. But of course, being a pretty poorly drafted bit of legislation, it's just ambiguous enough that claims like these, claims that this is about, destroying end-to-end encryption need to be taken seriously. Frankly, it's a little bit too ambiguous. But again, it's not my view that the government is actually seeking to ban encryption or to destroy or regulate E2E per se. Right?
Right. And one of the things that people are most worried about is, as you said, it's a very vague bill. And that's one of the issues that a lot of people have brought up, that because it isn't specific, there's a lot of wriggle room in there. And that's not something you want when you have a government dealing with interception and surveillance and all of that. And one of the other things is the lack of judicial oversight that is in this. How much power are we actually giving away?
Well, this doesn't allow this bill doesn't grant access rights to government, right? So that's still covered under the existing warrant process. So if you want to be intercepting people's messages in real time, you still need to go to court and get a telecommunications interception warrant. which is, the offence that they're investigating. It needs to be a specific offence. It needs to carry X number of years jail time. I mean, we're talking about
unless there's national security interests, I'm sure.
There can be other authorizations. That's why I mentioned authorizations previously, like authorizations directly from the Attorney General and things like counterterrorism investigations and things like that. But that's not changing under this bill. Those authorizations already exist. So this is much more about, okay, we've got our authorization. And, currently in things like counterterrorism investigations, child exploitation investigations, the government already has the authority to on its own go and hack devices and obtain information this way. That authority component isn't changing. What they're seeking to change is to make the technical process of obtaining the information that they're authorized to obtain easier. And that's the part that's got people nervous, is like, quite naturally people are thinking, well, if you're making it easier for the government to obtain this stuff, surely that will make it easier for, say, criminals to access devices as well without authorization.
Well, I think one of the issues as well, and Apple has pushed back about this, about the idea of putting backdoors into actual devices, is that if you make these systems vulnerable, then they're vulnerable for everyone. Like if you make it easier for the government to access things, then that does, decrease security on those devices. Like Perry, you've looked into a lot of these types of schemes proposed before. What are the dangers of putting like backdoors on actual devices?
Well, so I don't know whether the Australian proposal actually mandates backdoors, but the general problem we have is that we don't know how to construct backdoors that only good people can use. Ignoring one's opinions about, whether the government will or will not ever abuse its powers. The problem is that information that supposedly only the government has access to is often not only retained by the government for, in perpetuity. I can name a lot of problems that have happened over the years. Some of them really stupid and embarrassing. The database of pretty much everyone who has a security clearance in the United States got stolen probably by the Chinese government some years ago. The sort of information that you would want to keep really, really top secret, because you would not want an opposing government to have a list of everyone who might be involved in espionage, and yet they managed to get access to the entire clearance applications database. There are very, very top secret tools that the NSA developed that someone, probably the Russians, but who knows exactly whom. Actually, Patrick would probably remember specifically which group of Russians. It's not the sort of thing I keep track of. But some group of inside the Russian government embarrassed the NSA by starting leaking a bunch of their hacking tools not that long ago. I think in the last couple of years. And then, of course, those ended up being abused by yet other groups of people. There are, the notion that the government might be able to keep some secret backdoor that only they would be able to use. The problem there is that all the technologies we can think of that would permit, a third party to access encrypted communications probably are amenable to being stolen. And, you don't really want to set things up so that potentially all of the world's communications could be compromised by parties unknown. If the US or Australian government were to mandate some sort of backdoors, how long would it be until the Chinese government or the Israeli government or whatever other government you're particularly afraid of this week had access to it? Or even various organized criminals? Hard to say, but eventually they would get access as well. We don't have magic methods of allowing lawful access that don't have really bad side effects to them. But I don't know that this Australian bill mandates backdoors. I don't even really quite understand what it mandates. Maybe that's part of the problem with it.
I'd love to jump in here, Naomi, if I may.
Oh, please do. Go ahead, Patrick.
So it's interesting that you mentioned the vagueness and the ambiguity of the bill, right? And that's kind of by design. And this is just such a tricky thing to try to legislate, right? Because if you start so a line that I've used before is you don't really want the Australian government making engineering decisions, right? So they're saying, we want to get this content. So we write this vague bill where we say, if we compel you, you have to do a thing that's reasonable and proportionate so that we can access this content. And people are saying, well, they're not saying what they want to do. And the government's position is, well, we don't think we're the best people to make that judgment of what sort of technical assistance, what that assistance specifically needs to look like in order for us to enable that material. We're going to leave that up to Google. We're going to leave that up to Apple. We're just going to say, we want you to do something, perhaps doing this, perhaps doing that, in order to obtain that material. Now, but
you're screwed both ways. That's the problem.
Well, the backdoor thing is the backdoor thing is interesting, right? Because we've been mentioning this backdoor thing, and the bill specifically states, and bear with me to the end here, this bill specifically states that any assistance provided cannot introduce a systemic weakness into like an ecosystem, right? And that sounds great. That sounds fantastic. But then when you try to define what a systemic weakness is, it's very hard. Now, to a degree, I would actually trust the courts to make that determination. But I think currently, and I'm not 110% sure on this, but as I understand it, currently, the party responsible for deciding what a systemic weakness is or is not is actually the Attorney General, right? And that's a part of the bill that I would really like to see change. Now, again, I don't think that necessarily this is a case of the government trying to be evil and slip some deliberately vague bill through so that they can abuse it later. I think it needs work, right?
This is the sort of thing which you usually need to spend an enormous amount of time very carefully examining.
Yes, and they're rushing it. They are absolutely rushing it. And we had an incident in Melbourne recently, which has really given this bill a push along. Some mentally ill, radicalized guy ran through the CBD in Melbourne trying to stab people. He was shot by police. Something like a week later, three men were arrested for planning a terrorist attack in Melbourne. So that has got, Home Affairs very twitchy.
And he had a telephone.
Well, there you go, right? But they had been up
I'm guessing,
Yeah, but I mean, that's given, the knee jerk is strong on that one. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, no, the terrorists in France who attacked the Bataclan, I discovered the news media was full of the fact that they all had telephones afterwards, which, immediately means that, that they're bad people. I mean, I think that they were bad people because they shot up the nightclub myself. But the fact that they had a telephone and may have used the telephones for communicating with each other about what they were going to do, I mean, it's shocking. But my question for Patrick is this, though. So, you've got this interesting problem, and it's a catch-22. If you make a bill like this too specific, you end up mandating particular technologies and potentially freezing technology and making it impossible to actually get progress. But if you make it too loose, you create a situation in which you allow courts, which are made up of lawyers, not engineers, to decide what might be reasonable or proportionate. And you might get a lawyer who happens to be sitting on the bench who really doesn't understand that certain things are or not possible from a technical point of view. So how does one reasonably balance this?
That's what expert witnesses are for, right? Like that's, that is really what expert witnesses are for. But, just based on the discussion we're having, the opinions on this are just so varied, right? That how do you can't get 5 people in a room together who are going to agree on anything with this, right? So
at least not quickly.
I'm just saying this is hard.
Yeah, I mean, the feeling I usually get from this sort of thing is that what you want to do usually is tread really, really, really carefully on this sort of thing, and be very careful about how you design a system like this. But it sounds like this legislation was not. I mean, how quickly did this get proposed, and how quickly did it, have they attempted to get it through?
It's been in the works for a while, but it really sort of started accelerating a few months ago. And, look, we've got to just take a moment, I think, to acknowledge that there are legitimate reasons why public safety agencies and security agencies want this capability. Like, they are tasked with a pretty fundamental role when you think about the role of government, which is...
And a difficult role.
Very difficult role, and it's getting harder, right? So we've got to really start thinking, do we want, opponents of any sort of capability like this? We've got to really think, do we want, there is a consequence to that, right? Is it an acceptable consequence? Well, that's maybe a conversation that we want to have. But to pretend that there's no consequence is, I think, a little naive, right?
Oh, sure. The problem, of course, from my point of view, is that at the same time that you do not want to, that you don't want to completely cripple the public safety agencies, you also don't want to give opportunities to, for even worse forms of mischief. And you don't want to, for example, enable the North Korean government to get better access to SCADA systems controlling power plants in the course of making it more, easier to conduct investigations and such, and it's a potentially real consequence. We don't know how to build security systems that will do just anything. We have engineering limitations. So from my point of view, you usually want to try to restrict such things. I mean, but again, it's difficult. I mean, on the one hand, as I said, you don't want to burn into a law specific capabilities, specific rules. Because if you do that, in 10 years, the law will either be obsolete or you will have managed to make sure that your technology is obsolete because it couldn't be updated.
Yes.
But on the other hand, you have the difficulty that if you just say things like reasonable and proportionate, then if you're at Google headquarters or what have you, and you're a lawyer, you suddenly say, I don't know what a court will interpret to be reasonable and proportionate. I don't know what I am and am not taking a risk in doing.
Naomi, I've just realized that we're guests on your show and we've just been...
No, guys, I invite you on here because you are two experts in this and I want people to learn from you about what's actually going on because I think it's so important. One thing I will say, though, is so the Register, a UK publication, came out with this saying that, there is this disconnect between the idea of, oh, yeah, we'll weaken the system just for us. And Perry, you mentioned this idea that, how do you stop the bad people getting hold of these backdoors as well? So what they said is there's this persistent strain of authoritarian magical thinking that keeps looking for some kind of reality hack that gives law enforcement what it wants without somehow breaking encryption. And so, and they're talking about how the government wants to force companies to push rootkits potentially onto users to receive messages and send messages without decrypting network traffic. So they call this dodgy technological sophistry involved. Well,
the Register is often very colorful.
Well, and that piece was written by Richard Chergwin, who I've known for a very long time. Grumpy Richard Chergwin, very wonderful piece there, and I think it's great that he's encouraging people to think deeply about this. But I will say that I am in touch with some, and I've been reporting on this stuff for a long time, right? So naturally, people I've met throughout my career, some of them work in government now, and fortunately, they'll talk to me about this sort of stuff. And I'm saying, look, what exactly are you after here? And they've been so reticent to actually start talking about specific capabilities because they don't want to get locked into one thing or another. It's this whole thing that we've just been talking about. But one official did provide me with some example use cases, right, which don't really have much to do with encryption. One of them was... And I thought this was interesting. I spoke about this on my program yesterday with Alex Stamos, the former chief security officer of Facebook. And he doesn't think this one will fly, and I'm skeptical as well, but it's an interesting idea. A lot of the talk has focused on, okay, the government wants to push out Trojans or dodgy updates to specific handsets, for example, bad iPhone patches that will give the government access to those phones. Their idea, though, is like, well, maybe we just want to ask, Apple or Google to withhold security updates from targeted devices so that we can then reverse engineer those security updates, figure out how to exploit the vulnerabilities that they're fixing, and use those exploits to gain access to a user's handset. So that's one example of a use case there, which to me, it's actually a little bit counterintuitive and also kind of clever. But of course, you start withholding security updates from certain devices, that means they're vulnerable to attack from everyone. But we are then just talking about a specific device, not an entire class of devices. So, and herein lies the problem with this whole bill, this whole approach, which is, what we said earlier. You have to sort of give it some wiggle room so that it's flexible, but then how do you counter potential abuses and stop the government from going too far and asking for too much? And this is a hard problem. It's a very hard problem to solve.
And when you talk about, I mean, what the government has actually said about this, they said we need access to digital networks and devices. By saying networks and devices, I mean, that gets a little bit scary, having access to all of our networks. Like, are they talking about intercepting all of our communications on all social media platforms, etc.? So it does seem that they want access to...
Again, like, there's no new authorization as part of this bill. Like, it doesn't change, it doesn't alter the circumstances under which police or security agencies can actually seek to obtain evidence. It's just really about trying to force the tech companies to help them achieve that, achieve that task, which they are legally authorized to do. And I think the government's done a terrible job there of not making that clear. A lot of people think that this bill is like, oh my God, they're going to rootkit everyone's phone, and that's not what this is.
Though in fairness, they've made it a little bit ambiguous what it actually is. It basically says, you'll help us. You won't necessarily, you'll help us do good things. You won't put in systematic weaknesses, at least not unreasonable ones.
And we're not going to tell you systemic weakness is. Yeah, no, I know, man. I'm with you 100%.
The thing that makes it a little weird here, I mean, is also, so what does it mean to help the government, accessing network stuff? I mean, right now, everyone except for the UK, but New Zealand and the US and Australia, et cetera, have all decided that they don't want Huawei equipment in their 5G networks. There's this big, for the people who are listening who don't know anything about cellular networks, right now your cell phone is on the LTE or 4G network, and there's a whole new generation of cell phone networks being built. And a lot of Western countries have decided that they do not want particular Chinese equipment manufacturers selling them equipment because they are worried that the Chinese government might want their own version, shall we say, of lawful intercept on cellular equipment that has been sold into foreign countries. So let's say that you're an Australian cellular equipment manufacturer, an American cellular equipment manufacturer, et cetera. You probably, do you necessarily want there to be a perception that your government is also requiring that your equipment be enabled in various ways? And you get into all sorts of very interesting trade war problems here, don't you?
Yeah. It's the balkanization trend of the internet, which is why, Western governments are not using Kaspersky antivirus anymore. A lot of, New Zealand had agreed, a company in New Zealand was going to do a 5G build using Huawei. They've just canceled that on advice from GCSB. And if you look, the UK is one of the Five Eyes nations that has used a lot of Huawei equipment. And they've set up, one of the things they did as part of this is they set up like this transparency initiative to really keep an eye on the use of Huawei, because they're like, we can unlock the economic benefit of this cheap equipment if we really pay attention to the security risks. They just put out a report very recently saying that it's gotten a little out of hand. Some of the engineering problems in that equipment is presenting national security risks. That's a whole other topic, though. That's quite complicated. But you do raise an interesting point about this bill. One of my advertisers, one of my sponsors, Sanitas, they make layer 2 encryption equipment, and they're quite concerned that this bill will give.
And they're Australians.
And they're Australians, right? And Edward Snowden was the best thing that ever happened to their business, because until that point, layer 2, fiber optic encryptors were kind of a niche business. And then all of a sudden, Edward Snowden released a bunch of documents that showed the world that like everybody needed the thing that they sold. So they've had a great time, and also made people quite suspicious of American technology. So they've been having a great time selling into markets that are suspicious of the United States. And now they're worried, hey, if this bill goes through, those markets are going to be quite concerned that, their equipment is going to contain, backdoors. The government has explicitly said that this doesn't apply to anything outside of the country. But, I know it's Sanitas's position that I think they would prefer to see defense licensed exporters, which they are, being explicitly exempted from this bill. But you're right. Like, there's so many edge cases here that make legislating around this very difficult. And that's where we are.
And I do want to jump in there, just talking about specific devices being created. And before I do, I just want to say a huge thank you to Polly and Derek for using the power chat function on Bitbacker. It's a new site I'm testing out instead of super chats, which take 30% of anything that you give to people in live streams. Bitbacker takes 1%. You can pay with cryptocurrency. So a huge thank you to Derek and Polly for using that. And to Anthony Monero, who says, who says, sooner or later, the world will use cryptos. We'll have two worlds, the wild web and the under-controlled web, like with XRP, Coinbase, etc. And so I wonder, on that note that Anthony brought up, when you're talking about these two distinct worlds, I wonder if you are just going to have new tech companies coming out and saying, okay, well, this is a product that hasn't been compromised. We'll put out this warrant canary so that, you know, if we are compromised, you'll at least know about it or something like that. I wonder if we are just going to have more and more companies go into these niche areas of security.
Warrant canaries, well, if you want to take it, I could take it too.
No, please, Perry. Please.
I'm very skeptical of warrant canaries because warrant canaries are one of these cute things that lawyers don't. People who aren't lawyers, and I'm not a lawyer, but I spend a lot of time talking to lawyers. Lawyers tend to and judges tend to view these sorts of things differently from the way that technologists do. Technologists view the rules of law like they were some sort of computer program, whereas judges tend to view the whole thing in terms of intent. And if the intent is, tend to view the whole thing in terms of intent. And if the intent, for example, is that there be no public disclosure that something has happened, they'll just happily order you not to alter your warrant canary. And what are you going to do about it? End up in contempt of court? No. And you might say, but this violates, the strict letter of the rule. And the judge, doesn't care. And neither do your lawyers, and neither does the nice comfy jail that you might be sent to if you ignore the judge. The way that, in the real world, unfortunately, whether you agree with laws or don't agree with laws, you find yourself subject to them.
Right.
And it really doesn't matter very much whether you think that they're great or you think that they're terrible. You kind of have to go along with them. So even if people would prefer to construct their own alternative internet reality that is not that isn't subject to all of these regulations, or where people say, well, I'll just encrypt my communications and screw them. If people get angry enough with you, especially if the government gets angry enough with you, they'll probably bring you into conformance or place you into an iron cage at some point. Usually, it's better.
Sorry. I just wanted, just while I've still got it in my head, I just wanted to back up for a second to something you said, Naomi, which is this idea that people will splinter off from the major platforms and start using these sort of rogue platforms that provide better security and aren't susceptible to surveillance. Look, under this bill, if you're a terrorist or someone committing serious crimes, the idea is the government would like to be able to access your device, and that means really forget about using anything Android, forget about using anything iOS, right, or an iPhone. And that's kind of what they want. People are saying, well, won't they just go off and use other devices? And yes, because those devices have a terrible track record. There was this company, I can't remember their name, but there's been a few of these companies that roll custom devices, like custom BlackBerries with PKI, very solid encryption on them, and they market them exclusively to criminals. And what happens is the FBI always investigate these people. They manage to completely own all of their infrastructure sideways, get all of the communications, and get a bunch of convictions. And we've seen this time and time again. The problem that we're facing now is that it's the mainstream platforms that are the best, right? If you want a secure communications, get yourself a fresh iPhone and Signal. And you are more or less impervious to law enforcement at that point, to the degree that, I read this major New York Times feature a few months back that was really talking about fentanyl and how Mexican drug cartels are moving into the fentanyl business because the profit margins are so extreme, and they're doing things like counterfeit oxy pills and things like that. And there was an interesting thing that was included in that article, which is that the standard issue communication device for an operative of the Sinaloa cartel when they're being sent into the United States is an iPhone with signal. So we've got to this point, right, where the smart criminals...
They have good OPSEC.
They have great OPSEC. And the thing is, they use an iPhone with signal. They're not using some specialist device because they know that the specialist device is not as secure as a device that has... I mean, Apple...
Patrick, do you remember what happened to the Turkish coup plotters, a couple of years ago?
With the WhatsApp thread?
No. So there was a coup attempt against Erdogan in Turkey. Yeah. It's been years now since that.
The whole thing was planned over WhatsApp. It was a giant WhatsApp group.
I thought that it wasn't, and that was the problem. That they were using some third party, some random secure communications package.
No. And the reason I know that is because, Bellingcat, who do all of the OSINT reporting and stuff, they're a very, very interesting group of people. They obtained a video where one of the soldiers who'd been arrested after the coup, they grabbed their phone and they scrolled back through all of these WhatsApp messages just in front of a video. Bellingcat sat down, transcribed the whole lot, and then pieced together a timeline of the coup. It was amazing.
Okay, so then what I had heard was urban legend, but the urban legend I had heard was that they had used an insecure platform because they had been worried that WhatsApp and things like that were not secure enough.
Yeah.
So I got something wrong, but WhatsApp has the same security protocol basically that Signal does. It does,
but it also has, like, most people back up their WhatsApp messages.
Yes, at which point there's no real point.
At which point, like, most people back up their WhatsApp messages.
Yes, at which point there's no real point.
At which point, and people say, oh, but aren't they encrypted? It's like, well, not really, because the whole point of backing them up is in case you lose your phone, you can get a new device and recover those messages. If you're backing up your messages, they are recoverable by law enforcement under warrant. End of story.
Well, it depends on what you've backed them up to. If you've backed them up to if you've backed them up to, done an encrypted backup to your laptop, it's one thing. If you back them up to iCloud and they're protected by your 4-digit PIN, it's
yeah, but that's the thing. They're a in-app cloud backup for WhatsApp messages.
The in-app cloud backup is useless in terms of security.
Yeah, and I'd imagine that one of the capabilities that they might like, the government might like here is, okay, we're interested in this user's WhatsApp chats. Can you please force a backup from that device, silent to the user? I mean, that's going to be the sort of stuff that we're going to see come out of a regime like this if it passes. I suspect it will.
And that's not a systematic security problem there. Yeah.
Well, but it's kind of a problem that already exists, isn't it? Like, they're just smudging the details a little bit to try to get an easy win. And I think that's more and more, what the government is seeking to do. They're not trying to take on Silicon Valley. They'll lose, right? They're trying to fiddle around the edges. That's my very strong sense of what this bill is about.
So talking about, like, iCloud backups, et cetera, et cetera. So currently Apple is able to provide access to iCloud backups that don't use end-to-end encryption, but they're not able to provide access to messages and FaceTime conversations, which do. And that would mean that Apple would have to comply in those cases. In order to comply, they would probably have to switch off end-to-end encryption in that case. But then I'm wondering, so, like, talking about Apple, and I mean, they really don't like this bill. They've joined with Facebook, Alphabet, and Amazon to jointly lobby this. I'm just wondering if you have any updates on how that lobby is going in order to go against this. So obviously, if they're concerned, I mean, it does make me worry if they're concerned. These are companies which haven't really been at the forefront of, like, we're going to protect all your data. They've gotten a lot of flack for sharing a lot of data in the past. So if they're even worried about what this will do, that makes me particularly concerned.
We have to remember when we're talking about Apple that this type of protection is core to not just its marketing, but its philosophy, right? So we've got this situation really where the government believes one thing, Apple very much believes the reverse. And, we saw an amazing manifestation of that after the San Bernardino shooting when, the FBI recovered an iPhone 5C. That belonged to the shooter. This is a obsolete device. All modern Apple phones contain a encryption device on board called the Secure Enclave Processor. This phone didn't, which meant that it would have been trivially easy for Apple to unlock that device and provide the FBI with evidence that it sought. And keep in mind, dead people who've just shot a bunch of people don't have privacy rights. Okay, so I think the FBI was within its rights to ask Apple to assist in that matter. Apple refused and launched a giant campaign.
Well, wasn't that because of the precedents that this would set? Because if they were to comply on this, because they ended up, I mean, Apple ended up going forward with that and refusing, and then the FBI ended up dropping it, right, and saying, actually, we don't need it anymore. So clearly they found a way in regardless. But I thought that the case, like, because they could have found a way around it and done it themselves, I thought the whole point of that case was to set a precedent so that going forward, they had a legal precedent that said, yes, we have the ability to make Apple unlock these devices.
That was a concern, but of course they refused before the court action, right? So, you know, it depends when, you know, which particular moment in time you look at this. But I think that them not providing assistance in that case was a mistake, because it really set up this crazy adversarial stare down between governments and tech. And that's sort of where we are now. No bill that is going to cede authority from, you know, tech won't support a bill that allows government any more authority over what it does. Like, full stop. They are just aghast at the idea. So I think that's the prism through which lobbying efforts are seen, as in, this is a real clash of philosophies and it's not going to be resolved. Okay, Apple, we get it. You don't like it. Now we're going to be over here discussing what we're actually doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, by the way, two points there. The modern iPhones now, with modern iOS, give you the opportunity to back up iMessages. And iMessages gets backed up to iCloud. And once it's in iCloud, it's iCloud's protection that is protecting your messages, not the iMessages end-to-end protection. But never mind, going forward a bit.
Yeah, I mean, backups are a huge...
Yeah, it's certainly...
a resource, shall we say.
Yeah, it's certainly the case that Apple has a philosophical opposition to this. I happen to think that Apple's philosophical opposition is probably reasonable. You know, they only want to give assistance if they're given court orders. You know, if there's, you know, not if they're just given, requests by the government.
I mean, we are talking about court orders in this case. Like, this would result in the production of court orders.
Yeah, I understand. Well, I mean, Apple has, repeatedly, routinely has to deal with government warrants. I mean, all of the large providers, have whole departments that deal with requests for assistance to law enforcement, and some of the time they fight it, and some of the time, they go along with it. I mean, it's pretty routine at this point. I mean, they have full-time staff dealing with a lot of this.
I do want to back up just a second there. I'm not actually entirely sure whether these notices under the bill would be court orders, but they would be accompanied by a court order, which would be seeking for
but here's the question though. So I'm not that as concerned, I've got to say personally, about the idea of the Australian government putting malware on someone's phone, because that's something that's done one at a time, two at a time, etc. Is it really the case though that this can't influence that the law could not influence the design of entire software systems or network systems to potentially reduce their security? I understand that it says that that it shouldn't do anything unreasonable like this, but
and you've just nailed the exact problem here. Like, that is the exact problem, which is how you actually. It's all very well and good to put a statement of intent into a bill that says we don't want to weaken a system, but trying to define that. That's really the hard part. You've just hit the nail on the head, and there is no easy solution there. There is no easy solution. That is, you've just very, very eloquently summed up the problem statement. How do you introduce a bill, that is designed not to introduce systemic weaknesses, but then how do you define what a systemic weakness is and whether or not that's proportional? That's the problem.
Yeah. I mean, to me, by the way, I have many friends who will probably be aghast at hearing me say this, but, I mean, if the government uses direct hacking, shall we say, against a particular single phone or looks at a particular single individual's backups or what have you, that's one thing. That's the sort of thing where it is not possible to go on fishing expeditions against millions of people at once. You can't decide that you're going to go after absolutely everyone who has ever said anything mildly critical of the government. If you, under circumstances like that, it's a very expensive proposition. I like the idea of mechanisms that are actually extremely financially expensive and take a lot of time, but ultimately permit access. Because that means that you only get to do it when you actually need to, rather than at random.
I think the problem, and that's where we are currently when it comes to signals intelligence, right? Is that, you know, agencies like NSA, ASD, they've got the tools. They don't need this bill, right? Like, to couch this as a Five Eyes thing, Five Eyes don't need this. They've got their very expensive tools that they can use to get this job done already, because this is high stakes stuff, right? When you start talking about signals intelligence, global power, very, very bad people, they can get the job done. The reason this bill's coming in now is much more because of, you know, lower agencies. You know, we're talking like federal police, even state police, who might be, you know, they're the ones tasked with things like murder investigations, right? So you might have a murder suspect. You go, okay, I want authority to tap this person's phone and view their messages. And you get that authority, and all of a sudden you've got no way to execute that warrant. Okay, so that's really where this one is. So is that going to result in targeted hacking? Yes. I guess what the bill's trying to do is make that hacking process a lot easier, because 0 days are very expensive.
But does it actually specify what sort of assistance? I mean, I get the impression it's pretty ambiguous. I mean, like, if let's say that you're the Australian, you know, federal police, and you're investigating someone, and you would like to put you'd like to put malware on their iPhone. You know that you can get access to their iPhone for an hour while they're at the dentist's or something. That's actually a silly example, but never mind. It's a great example, Perry. There's some circumstance where you believe you can get, you know, access for a limited period of time to one of their devices, and you'd like to do that. What under this is the obligation of the manufacturer of their telephone?
Well, to be able to do it remotely. That's the thing, not while they're at the gym. And first of all,
is that actually in the bill, that you have to be able to do it remotely?
Well, it's my understanding that this is, you know, very much about remote and silent access to people's devices. That's the problem that they're trying to solve. But first of all, look, if you leave your phone in the gym, people can't unlock it. Even if you have physical access to the device. I mean, post-SEP iPhones, like, forget it.
It's very, very difficult given current iPhones. But let's say that, but does the bill obligate, you know, Apple to produce, you know, circumvention mechanisms for that?
Well, we don't really know that, do we? And
that's the problem.
But I would suspect that, you know, that's why this whole thing about the systemic weakness thing is everything in this bill. If you can solve that problem, everybody gets their cake and eats it too. But I suspect that whatever winds up being hammered out is going to be a compromise. Just simple as that. There's no way that you can pass a bill like this and keep everyone happy and satisfied.
But I have a question. Is the bill going to pass as it stands?
I don't know, but Naomi has a question.
Okay.
Oh, that's a great question. Is it going to pass as well? You said that they had hearings currently, and they're actually live streams of the hearings. So maybe we'll check back in, or at least I'll check back in with you, and maybe we can update people later. But I'm also wondering, like, what the jurisdiction is that this bill would cover. Like, is it where the servers are of the company? Is it the users, where the users are? Is it, you know, people who are in Australia? Is it Australian citizens abroad? Like, what is the scope of this? Do you know?
Look, I'd say that is going to come down to the jurisdiction of the authorizations. I'm not a lawyer, right? So I am just trying to make an educated guess here, but I would say that it would be determined by, like, okay, anyone who's subject to the jurisdiction of Australian courts. So
if you buy a Huawei phone in Hong Kong and bring it to Australia, so if you buy a Huawei phone in Hong Kong and bring it to Australia, they may not be able to request assistance. Or
got to remember too that, like, some of this assistance, right? Some of these devices come with some pretty awful software on them already that's quite easy to exploit if you have the assistance of carriers. Like, one example is the
even if you don't, Android.
Well, Android's got a lot better, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons you're seeing bills like this.
If you're running recent versions and you keep the phone up to date, both of which are giant ifs.
Yes, but don't forget there's these over the air carrier management software that allows the telcos to better manage devices, and quite often it's a clown show full of vulnerabilities. So, I think having that framework where you can demand assistance. Hey, this person's brought a phone into this country. It is using this type of software that's beaconing out, attempting. Is using this type of software that's beaconing out, attempting to contact this server. And if we can get in the middle of that communication with the assistance of the telco, we might be able to exploit it. I just really get the sense that that's the type of assist telco. We might be able to exploit it. I just really get the sense that that's the type of assistance that's being sought here. But you're right in that you can construct a hypothetical scenario which says that systemic weaknesses should be introduced, even though the bill specifically states that they can't. And how do you apply a test, and who gets to decide what a systemic weakness is and is not? Like that's the problem. We're not going to solve it here, unfortunately.
Right.
I don't think we're going to solve it here.
And we don't even get a say, because at the end of the day, it's the politicians who vote, right?
Yeah, but I mean, there's a lot of bipartisan work that happens in Australia on this stuff, right? We've got the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. We've got the Conservative coalition in government at the moment. The chair is a very conservative politician named Andrew Hastie, but there are independents in that committee and the Australian Labor Party, which is our centre-left party. And they do a lot of work generally behind closed doors to try to iron out the worst. I mean, we saw that with the metadata retention bill, which was highly controversial. Very similar legislation to what applies in America right now, where the telcos have to keep, metadata about call information so that authorities can then obtain that information. So, yeah, there is work. I really hope that this bill gets a redraft. I suspect it will go through, but I'm hoping it will go through after it's been through another round of PJCIS amendments and we get something that looks a bit more sensible.
Right. And I have another point to bring up that sort of happened.
Looks a bit more sensible.
Right. And I have another point to bring up that sort of happened, I think, around the same time that this bill was put forward. So New Zealand, same area of the world, where now if you go in and out of New Zealand, and I think it applies not just at the border, but at any time, if you're asked by a law enforcement agent to give over your password and PIN, you're required to do so. If you don't, you're charged $5,000 and they take your device away for forensic testing anyway. So this is, you're talking about having like physical access to devices and not being able to, do this. But you have the New Zealand government sort of setting a precedent, this very aggressive step forward to say, well, now you have to give us access to these devices, which I think is interesting. And I'm not sure that
only if you travel into and out of the country, though.
I think is interesting, and I'm not sure that
only if you travel into and out of the country, though.
Well, look, I was surprised to see that one making news because that's been the law in Australia for a long time. And I believe it's also the law in the United States.
It's not the law in the United States.
When crossing a border?
If, as a U.S. citizen, I can cross the border and they can ask me for anything they want, and if I say no, they cannot really do terribly much.
I'm Googling that.
Absolutely the case. The most that as a U.S. citizen, they cannot keep me from entering the country. Unless they can arrest me they cannot keep me from entering the country. Unless they can arrest me if they have evidence of a crime, but they can't keep me from entering the country, and they can't require that I give them them passwords. They can seize my device for a while.
CBC, US border guards can now search your phone. Here are some details on how border agents can demand a password to open your phone without probable cause.
But you're not required to give it to them.
That's interesting. And yeah, I suppose they can't deny you entry. They can send it away. They can put it in a bag and send it away for testing. But
sure, but they can't do very much else. Now there is the question. Now there are some proposals. Very much else. Now there is the question. Now there are some proposals that they be allowed to ask people who are applying for visas and what have you for their social networking passwords.
Is that really a bill right now?
It's not. I don't know that it's a bill, but there's a proposal to that.
Not even a bill, right? Like they probably don't even need to pass new laws to do that because non-citizens don't have rights. So
non-U.S. persons have no rights. If you're a U.S. person, which is slightly more than a citizen, permanent residence as well.
Yeah, no.
Yeah. We have weird laws. But
like border crossings, right? Like people freak out about, you know, like sometimes I feel like people freak out about the wrong stuff because, you know, you got this situation where in a lot of countries, the police can actually ask customs to seize people's devices when they're on their way through, with no probable cause. And then they can obtain information from those devices. Like border crossings is the one area where I just think it's alarming. Like we've seen cases, a New Zealand case actually, where customs seized the phone of the spouse of someone they were investigating, and they just got a totally free look at that person's device because they're in that sort of legal no man's land of an airport. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Because they're in that sort of legal no man's land of an airport. It's crazy.
Yeah, well, the interesting problem there is, you know, we're putting more and more of our lives on our phones.
Yes.
And, you know, ignoring the question of, for the moment, of what law enforcement might want to do that's completely legitimate. What happens when you get a rogue customs agent who finds that it's a convenient way to supplement their income by getting information on people's banking information as they go through? I don't know.
About the lack of due process when it comes to, you know, collecting intelligence from people's devices with zero oversight because they're crossing a border and we can. And that's a thing that happens. And that's zero oversight because they're crossing a border and we can. And that's a thing that happens. And that's, you know, to me, that is a giant, you know, that's a giant problem. And it's one that gets no attention. It's amazing.
Yeah. And it's, I mean, the people who are here, like I could say as a foreigner who lives in America, going in and out of the country is an absolute nightmare. And every single time I get called away for, yeah, but twice as much. And I'm from Australia, which they, you know, look at reasonably favorably. And I'm from Australia, which they, you know, look at reasonably favorably. And I have all the right visas and whatnot to get in. And still, every time I enter, I get taken away for questioning. I wait an hour in a room for them to look at my files. They ask me questions, you know, and then so if I please them, then they let me through. But they're totally within their rights, no matter what visas I have, to turn me away.
So I mean, what is ever traveling?
That's right. I should just stay in my apartment forever because it's so spacious and wonderful. But it's like, that's why you're not getting people up in arms about this, because American citizens generally aren't affected as much by this. And foreigners, they're just lucky to be, you know, in the country, and they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to say anything that's going to get them in trouble and potentially get them denied. So really, this is an issue that I don't see being solved anytime soon.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. But it's just a weird situation, I think.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, what is the consensus, just to start to wrap up now? So we don't know whether this bill is going to go. I mean, what is the consensus, just to start to wrap up now? So we don't know whether this bill is going to go through. Some people say that it's perfectly fine because it's not going to introduce these systemic risks into different systems. Other people say that it's terribly vague. There's no judicial oversight, and it could be just like a slippery slope for the government to get more and more power. So, like, what are your thoughts about the success of this bill, whether you think it'll go through? And if it does go through, is the government going to fall down that slippery slope? Are we going to see more and more encroaching into the daily lives of ordinary citizens, not just people being targeted for terrorism?
I think the authorities are busy enough with legit threats that I'm less concerned with the slippery slope argument. I think there are some that I'm less concerned with the slippery slope argument. I think we need to start thinking about broader reform around some of the law involving how this information, how authorities are authorized to obtain this information. Like if they're going after stored communications on someone's device that is switched on in their pocket, I would like to see them having to get a telecommunications interception warrant, not a search warrant for that information. I would like to see them heavily restricted in terms of what types of evidence they can obtain. I know someone who has been charged with an offence in Australia, excuse me, by state police. They've asked him to turn over passwords. He's refused, and because it's a state crime, they can't really do much about it. But they'd said, you know, like, we will not limit the scope of our search of this device to the offense that we are alleging. Stuff like that needs reform, in my view. If the government's going to ask us for this type of capability, I think they need to get real and perhaps, yeah, tighten things up a little bit, so that we can be assured that they're only going to use this capability against people who are committing serious crimes, and they're not going to use access to devices to go on fishing expeditions against people where they can't prove crime A, but they might find evidence of crime B on their devices. It's my feeling that this will go through. It's going to be an absolute shit fight, excuse my language, when they finally ask for too much. But slippery slope, not so much of a concern for me, because I also realize that, you know, if you've got a government that goes rogue, there's a lot of other stuff they can do that sort of makes this a little bit irrelevant. There's a lot of other stuff they can do that sort of makes this a little bit irrelevant. Like we see in China, where if the Chinese government can't get the access it likes to a service, they just block it, you know, and then everyone winds up using WeChat, which is, you know, the government has unfettered access to messages on that platform. We saw that in Syria as well, where the government has unfettered access to messages on that platform. We saw that in Syria as well, where people would try to download Skype and they'd be redirected to some really dodgy knockoff website that, you know, where they could download their Trojan version. Once you've got a government that has gone wild, like stuff like this doesn't matter as much as people think it does.
Well, to me, the issue is the intermediate state. You find yourself in a situation in which a government has not yet, shall we say, gone rogue, but might, for instance, want to. And if it has too much access, in the modern world, if you have sufficient amounts of access, you can get lots and lots of access to your political enemies' information. You can, you know, I mean, you discuss pretty routinely on your show things like governments that use malware to try to track down dissidents, journalists they don't like, etc. You know, if you
we don't really have a track record of doing that in Australia, though.
That's true, but the thing,
political opponents with this.
Oh, sure, but the difference between, you know, we have countries that in the course of a few years have transformed from ones that were quite good to being quite bad. Hungary, for example, which in a very brief period of time went from being a quite free country to one where the government has been routinely interfering with journalists and tracking down political enemies, etc., and where the EU has started getting, you know, wondering whether this is really a country that they appreciate having as you know, inside the fold. But you get situations where countries go bad. I mean, we think you get situations where countries go bad. I mean, we think you and I live in countries that are particularly stable. Not all countries are like that. And you can get into these situations in which a government gets elected that has less respect than normal for political rights, for human rights, decides that it would like to abuse some of these systems in order to find out what their political enemies are thinking, doing, plotting. They'd like to cut off street protests before they occur, check who the journalists are talking to, etc. And, you know, as has happened in Turkey, in Hungary, etc. Turkey was a much freer country until recently.
I was yeah, I mean, when was that? Like about 11 years ago, I was there and just watching it slide. My God.
Right. And so we have, and so it's all fine and well to say, well, you know, there isn't much risk in Australia or much risk in the United States. But what about, say, Poland?
Okay. So here's the thing. We had the Cloud Act, which passed recently. Sorry, Naomi, do we have time for me to talk about?
You have as much time as you guys want. So please go ahead.
The Cloud Act is an interesting one, right? Because that is designed to essentially reform the process by which countries like Australia can request evidence from US-based tech firms, right? The process by which countries like Australia can request evidence from US-based tech firms, right? So the way it previously worked is if I'm an Australian policeman or policewoman and I wanted to get access to someone's Gmail, right? I would have to file a request with the Australian Attorney General through a mutual assistance in legal matters act request, right? So this request would have to go from me to the Attorney General to the US Attorney General to the FBI to be served and then back again. And that process would take something like 18 to 24 months. And it was a problem. Those MLAT treaties were written in the 80s, right? So the Cloud Act comes along and it says, okay, now US countries can actually provide stuff directly on court authorization from jurisdictions outside of the US, but it's the United States that decides which jurisdictions are acceptable. So I don't know that we're actually on the Cloud Act list yet, but it's coming. So the idea being that an Australian magistrate's court might say we're seeking evidence, Australian magistrate might say, we're seeking evidence on this particular crime. They send that to Facebook, Google, Apple, whatever. They get an answer back for some sort of stored evidence. I imagine that we're maybe going to head down the same path with capabilities like this, because all of these companies, they're US companies, and I'd imagine there is a role for the US government in determining which countries they are and are not allowed to assist. Now, look, in my dream world, those determinations would be made along grounds like the quality of the courts, the quality of the laws, human rights records, things like that. My fear, however, is that this type of capability will be doled out to strategic allies of the United States without any sort of concern for those things, which is why, much like military technology is sort of sold off to various horrible governments by the United States. So I do think that there's going to be that conversation, right, around these capabilities, right? Say Australia gets it and then Australia goes rogue. The United States government could instruct Apple, Google, Facebook, whatever, to stop cooperating with Australian law enforcement. So that is like, from a Australian point of view, that's actually kind of a check and balance. But again, you don't mind seeing, the United States doesn't seem to mind selling, huge quantities of weapons to countries like Saudi Arabia. So,
well, but at the same time, so taking a step to the side, so let's say that we decide, that there are good reasons why it should be possible at the request of the US courts or the Australian courts or the British courts, which we think of as being, great, wonderful people, that it's British courts, which we think of as being, great, wonderful people, that it should be possible to install malware on someone's phone because they're a bad person. But the technology to do that, presumably, is present in this model of phone, regardless of where it is. Is present in this model of phone, regardless of where it is. So how do I then?
I'm going to just stop you there, because I'd imagine that whatever framework people come up with, it's going to be the tech companies who are enabling this access. I cannot see a situation where Australian law enforcement is going to wind up with some sort of interception portal. It's going to be a document that gets sent to the tech company that says, please enable this access for this thing. And of course,
not quite what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is then why the Chinese government may start demanding the same access. The Russian government may start demanding the same access. And maybe if they can resist that, maybe it will be harder to resist it when the Hungarian government or the Polish government has been, in the middle of this scandal. They replaced the Supreme Court, and now there's an order for them to reinstate their Supreme Court, and in a gigantic mess. But there are countries that are right on the edge. What if one of them says, "Hey, we demand access to this thing. You have you do business in our country. You've done this for the Australians. You've done this for the Americans. You have to provide us with targeted malware when there's someone that we want to monitor. And it's our courts that get to decide who does this, not you, Mr. Tech Company. You've done it for everyone else." It gets harder and harder to resist.
It does, but and yet we have a framework under the Cloud Act that is designed to tackle that particular problem when it comes to the retrieval of stored information.
And you yourself were worried a moment ago, though, that it might...
The retrieval of stored information.
And you yourself were worried a moment ago, though, that it might not always be decided on the basis of who's got the most reasonable courts, but sometimes on the basis of who is the most strategic foreign partner.
Of course. Absolutely. 100%. Of course. But, again, it's complicated. It's very complicated. And, the fact is we are in a situation where law enforcement agencies are feeling the squeeze. They are asking people higher up than them, elected people, to push this as an issue. And I guess we're just going to see where it lands. But I suspect that the current situation, I guess we're just going to see where it lands. But I suspect that the current situation where law enforcement is simply unable to execute surveillance warrants against people who are doing quite awful things, I don't think that that's long-term tenable. I think something's going to have to change, and I don't know if this bill is it, but let's see.
Yeah, well, right. As I said, I mean, my concern is, right. As I said, I mean, my concern is, I think that it's entirely reasonable that people are worried about investigating, murders and kidnappings and the like. I just worry about knock-on effects, and because, things are rarely only used for the, and because, things are rarely only used for the purpose for which they are intended. You have to be very, very careful about these things, and one of the things that disturbs me, careful about these things, and one of the things that disturbs me is the speed with which it seems to be that this law has been pushed, rather than carefully consulting with the technologists about what is and what isn't feasible. It seems like
well, that's the guy, the particular politician, Naomi. I understand you are originally from Australia. Do you keep up with Australian politics?
You know what? I don't at all. It's American politics is enough for me to handle right now. But I do try to keep in touch with what's happening in terms of like the tech sector and surveillance, and I work primarily with what's happening in terms of like the tech sector and surveillance, and I work primarily in the blockchain space, so always keeping up with that side of things. But in terms of general politics, it seems, I mean, every second week you've got a new leader in because they've ousted the old one in some sort of coup. And so I can't even keep up with who's prime minister there right now,
But I mean, if I say there's a politician we call the potato, do you know who I'm talking about?
I don't. Who's the potato?
Okay, so that's Peter Dutton. Okay, so just one thing for context and why this is being pushed so hard is Peter Dutton is a very right-wing, by Australian standards. He's quite a right-wing politician who looks like a potato, and has a background as a Queensland police officer, and now he's our Home Affairs Minister. And he's just the type of guy who's going to push stuff like this without much regard to doing it carefully. So I think that's one issue why we're seeing it. He's trying to get it through before Christmas, because that's just how Potato Man rolls. So I think that's honestly, I feel like that comes down to the personality of the minister who's responsible for this. The personality of the minister who's responsible for this legislation is he's just that type of guy. So we'll see how it goes for him.
Yeah, and we'll have to see. Like, I haven't really seen the Australian population talking about this. A lot of people that I've spoken to didn't even know there was anything like this going through at the moment and being looked at. So it does make me wonder why the media isn't really talking about it. Is that your experience, that you haven't really seen the media look into this too closely?
No, it's coming up. I mean, it's getting reported. I obviously tune into it a bit because, this is stuff that I cover. But, you flick on ABC News, it's there. But people do look. I think one thing that's very interesting, in most of my audience is based in the United States, right? And the typical American has a very different relationship to its government and the state than the typical Australian. I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about, Naomi, because Americans seem to just have this inherent almost borderline hatred of government as a thing. Like, they see it as this sort of barely necessary evil, whereas
it's not borderline.
Whereas in Australia, evil. Whereas
it's not borderline.
Whereas in Australia, I think we just have such a different way of structuring and ordering our society. We've got universal healthcare, we've got free education, or mostly free anyway. We've got like heavily subsidized education where you take out like a government loan that you pay back later as a tax. HEX, I'm sure, Naomi, you're familiar with that. So, we've just got this different relationship with the government where generally we feel like it does right by us. So stuff like this tends to get less pounced on. and less, it's less contentious here, because just that, as I say, that relationship is a little bit better. Don't get me wrong, we think they're all idiots, but we recognize that they're necessary idiots and that they keep the trains on running on time.
And that's a whole other can of worms that we could go into in another hour talking about.
Yeah,
Let's
totally.
dissect what you just said about Australia and the free things given there. But on that note, I may just wrap up now. And I mean, we've covered a lot here. I do want to check back in with you, Patrick and Perry, about what happens with this bill, and maybe check in down the line, see if there are any consequences that you're saying that they probably won't happen. Perry, you're saying consequences that you're saying that they probably won't happen. Perry, you're saying that we should be worried of the potential of them happening. So let's check back in and just see what happens there. My personal perspective is that the Australian population should be a lot more wary about this. You talk about them as idiots. I talk about them as people with personal incentives that they.
I was referring to the politicians, not.
Oh,
the,
no, I'm referring to the politicians as well. But people are always going to act in their best interests. So sometimes that doesn't necessarily align with what's in the public's best interest. So I do worry about things like this that kind of rock the balance of power. But let's check back in. But a huge thank you to both of you. It's just really wonderful to have you hash this subject out and give us a lot of information about what's actually going on. There was a petition against this, got information about what's actually going on. There was a petition against this going around. I don't know if you guys signed it. There's a lot of things going on, a lot of petitions in Australia, actually, but I haven't seen them be spread much. So maybe like more education about what this bill actually stands for could be helpful. But as I said, huge thank you to both of you for being here. Huge thank you to Derek, Polly, and Anthony for using the Power Chat and the Super Chat functions. Really appreciate that. And huge thank you to everyone who's been in the chat. I'd love it if you would subscribe to the channel. Helps me a great deal. But thank you so much for everyone for being here. And I hope to chat to you soon. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you so much, Naomi. This was really enjoyable. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, goodbye.
All right. It's not stopping. It will in a second.